Thanks, Lockie. That's a really awesome introduction there. I really appreciate it. I switched up the topic a little bit because we had a recent release of Linkerd 2.8, which supports multi-cluster. So we're going beyond building blocks, and I see that there have been some questions and conversations about multi-cluster and using a service mesh in that context. So I'm pretty excited about this. So with that, I will get started because I've got quite a bit to get through in 25 minutes. I'd like to make sure we get some questions. So I hope you all can see my slides. Okay, so as I mentioned, Linkerd 2.8 has support for multiple clusters, and we accomplished, what I'm going to talk about today is how we accomplished this, the pieces that we use, components that we've created, and how we've integrated with Kubernetes core resources in order to accomplish this. So the agenda here, quick service mesh overview, very quick actually, and then we'll dive into the fun part. And if I can pull it off, we'll do a live demo as well. So the service mesh overview, this is the typical example that we see of a distributed system in many talks, and it's probably my least favorite slide. What we really see in a real distributed application is multiple instances of multiple services communicating with each other, with external APIs, with databases. And in order to manage the cognitive load of all of this, we need something that will tell us how things are performing, when there are errors. And so probably my favorite slide is this one, where when things go wrong, when you've got a service going slowly, or if that external API is rejecting your requests based off of rate limits, or your database just starts to go on fire. You know, we need a way to understand this, and the service mesh adds a layer of abstraction that allows us to do this. This is accomplished by using sidecar proxies, and I've heard a few talks today already of folks talking about what sidecars are, how they're used. We're really excited to see the sidecar resource being pushed to alpha and hopefully soon to beta in upcoming versions of Kubernetes. So the Linkerd data plane injects a sidecar proxy into each of the pods, and it then manages all the traffic to and from those services within the pod. The control plane configures each of those containers as those proxies as they come up. So I have other presentations that go into much more detail about this, but again, I'm really excited to start talking about multi-cluster stuff. So if you have more questions about service mesh, I'll have all my contact details afterwards, and y'all can hit me up there. The things that the service mesh offers are observability, security, reliability, and traffic management. And those are core concepts across all service meshes. And in Linkerd, we accomplish those through mutual TLS, through collecting Prometheus metrics, and through load balancing. And all of this is done transparently. And what that means is you don't have to instrument your code to accomplish things like getting metrics, right? So for example, if you are writing a new service and you want to get Prometheus metrics from it, typically you might have to find the Prometheus library that is for the language of your service, and then implement it so that you then have an endpoint where you can collect these metrics. But Linkerd, because the proxies sit in front of the services, provides those metrics for you, and so now your engineers are writing less code, which everybody loves. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about high-level service mesh stuff. Let's jump into the multi-cluster concepts around Linkerd. Well, even from a higher level, multi-cluster concepts. So when you have multiple clusters, and you'll see in a minute here why my clusters are so disproportionately large compared to the services running within them. When we first spoke with the Linkerd community and Linkerd users, and they were asking about support for multi-cluster, we took the time to figure out and to ask them what they expect from a multi-cluster environment. What would they use multiple clusters for? And so a lot of the answers that we got were around traffic migration, canary deployments, different environments, and you can see how each of those might actually tie together. You might have a staging cluster or a production cluster, and you want to do canary deployments or blue-green deployments across those, and that involves traffic migration. And then you have other notions as well as availability zones and failover. So there are plenty of valid use cases for multiple clusters. And in order to get the observability and the security that I talked about from the service mesh, then becomes the idea of how do I take my clusters in multiple zones, my services running in different clusters, even in the same data center, how do I unify the metrics that I can get from them and ensure that the traffic is secure if you're operating in a zero trust environment. And so that is where we started thinking about using Linkerd to accomplish this. So multi-cluster with Linkerd is pretty straightforward. There are two components that we add in addition to the Linkerd control plane. You've got the Linkerd gateway, which is a load balancer resource that exposes an endpoint for inter-cluster communication. And part of what I'll show you in the demo is that when we deploy this gateway, we use certificates that are assigned to the gateways so that only communication between those gateways is allowed, and the service mirror. The service mirror is I would consider it like a maintenance component. So as new services are added to your cluster and as those services are exported in a way, in a multi-cluster way, this component monitors the configured gateways to make sure that they're healthy, and it creates these mirrored services from Kubernetes events. And again, that's one of the real tenets of Linkerd, is that we want to make sure that we're using as much of the available resources and code inside of Kubernetes without having to generate new CRDs or new resources. So these two components are stored in a namespace called Linkerd multi-cluster, and there's also a service account that's created along with those to allow for that fine-grained control. So when we put all this together, there's another, we have to link the clusters as well, and that's the service account that I was talking about. So when we actually go through the process of linking the clusters using the link command, the service account is exported from one cluster, and I use the nomenclature east and west here. And this is all in the Linkerd documentation. You can check it out. It's getting started with multi-cluster, and that describes how, actually there's a whole walkthrough, and I've basically taken that walkthrough, and that's going to be our demo for today. So the service account is exported as a Kubernetes secret, a kubeconfig file, and the service mirror then uses that secret to communicate with the API server on the other side. So this is where the security, part of the security mechanism comes from, so that we're not exposing too much. And now when we put this all together, what we see is that we've got our Linkerd control plane running in each cluster. We've got the Linkerd multi-cluster namespace with our service mirror and gateway components. And then we have all of our workloads. And so the workloads that I'm going to use today come from our friend Stefan Proden and the work that he's done with the PodInfo demonstration. And we'll see how that works as well. And then the last thing that we'll take a look at is how we can actually do some of this traffic splitting. So if we wanted to evenly distribute traffic across the two clusters, we would be able to do that through the traffic split resource, which is part of the service mesh interface spec, which I know that you worked really hard on Locky, along with some of the other folks at HashiCorp, at Buoyant. I know Aspen Mesh, and I know I'm forgetting some of the names, but it's a true collaborative effort to define standards for service meshes, which I love it. So, so with that, let's jump into the demo. I've written about some scripts that are going to do a lot of the work behind the scenes for me. I will be sharing all of this as part of my demos repository on GitHub. So when we use, look at the context, you'll see that I have East and West, and these are two clusters in separate managed providers whose names shall not be mentioned at the moment. And the scripts are going to go and, well, let's look at all the pods in each of the clusters so that you know that I don't have any tricks up my sleeve. So what we see are these clusters that I set up last night, and there's nothing in them except for the Cube system pods. So brand new, ready to rock clusters. So the first thing that we're going to do is install Linkerd. Oops, that's the last thing we're going to do. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is install Linkerd. And you'll see all these resources being created here. This is just installing the control plane onto each of the clusters. We're running the checks, and this will take a minute for things to come up. Like I said, all of this is part of the tutorial that we have in the Linkerd docs. And as each of these pods come up, we'll see that the Linkerd namespace is becoming ready. And the next thing that we'll do is install the Linkerd multi-cluster components. And so those will come up much faster. They are, again, the gateway and the service mirror. And the gateway we implemented through using Nginx. And what that does is it exposes the load balancer, like I mentioned, and provides an endpoint so that the two clusters can talk to each other. So it looks like that finished. We'll run our commands again to see all of the pods in each of the clusters, and we see now that I have Linkerd running, and we are ready to get busy with multi-cluster. So the next one is creating the cluster roles, that service account that I mentioned. It creates the namespace, and as the gateways are coming up, we're checking to make sure that things are running properly. And what we will see from this Linkerd check command is some additional information, and I'll scroll back up in just one second. So here we go. We have this Linkerd multi-cluster source, which is a new check that we've added to make sure that that the multi-cluster components are running correctly. And what we'll see when a little bit later, once the clusters are actually linked, we'll see that we're checking to make sure that the gateways are all healthy. So here's that load balancer that I mentioned, and we'll get an IP address there shortly. I know that one of my clusters takes a little bit of time to provision that external IP, but we have some time to run these other commands. Actually, let's see, yeah, linking the clusters requires that IP to be available. So there may be an error here, we'll see. Yeah, so you can see that the check is working, which is good. We know that there's no endpoint, and because I've run through this, I know that it's in the east. Oops, here we go. That's a little bit too much information. Let's break that down and did -A. Looking at all the, there we go, all the services. There we go. Okay, so it's still pending. I'm certain that we have the one in the west. So I'm about to expose a public IP, so please be kind. This cluster won't be around for very long, so that's okay. We'll just wait for that to come up. While I do that, let's look at the Linkerd, the link command. So all of this is part of the Linkerd CLI, and we've added a new subcommand called multi-cluster, and that subcommand is has child commands. And what we have here is multi-cluster link, and we're linking east and applying that change to the west cluster. So let's check on our IP address. Great, we've got it. So now we can actually link the two clusters. So everything's configured, and in this multi-cluster check, we now see that the gateways are alive. So this means that our two clusters are communicating using those certificates that we created earlier. So if I were to try and hit that endpoint on the gateway, I would get no response, which is exactly what we want. Great. Okay, let's take a look at the pods again. And my font's gotten a little big here. There we go. Okay, so again, we started with nothing but cube system, and now we have the Linkerd pods, and now we have the Linkerd multi-cluster namespace. And we can see the same in the east. So our clusters are looking very identical right now, which is exactly what we want. Now we're going to install the podinfo demo application. So that just installs or deploys a front-end service, which has a cute little cuttlefish, and a podinfo service, which provides information about the pod that is being connected to from the front end. So we've got our pods on the west are rolled out, and shortly our pods on the east will be rolled out. And this script will also try to make some curl requests, and it should open a browser as well. So if my screen jumps around, that's what's going on. In fact, let's see. Yep, okay, so that's still installing. What are other things that I can tell you about the multi-cluster work? Okay, we're port forwarding. There it goes. Okay, so here we see greetings from West. This is the pod info for on the West cluster. So again, I'll keep checking the pods. We see now we have our test namespace, and we have front end and 2 instances of pod info running there. And we have the same thing on the east. So far, again, our clusters are identical. They're linked, but we're not yet mirroring services. And that's what we're going to do next. And we do that by exporting the services. So what this did is, and we'll take a look at this. Again, it's another multi-cluster command. We're exporting the service. And so all this is doing is taking the YAML for the pod info in the east cluster. It's adding 2 annotations to it, which are Linkerd specific. The service mirror component that I mentioned is going to detect those annotations. And then what that ends up doing for us is creating a new service in, test. So that's in the east, but in the west, we see now that we have this service called podinfo east. But if we look at the pods, we see that we still just have the regular podinfo services there, those same 2 that we had before. So we've created this service which the service mirror knows to route traffic to. So now we've exported our services, which is exactly what we want. So the next step is we'll take a look at some of the stats so that we can be sure that, open the dashboard again. I'll pull that tab up in a second here. So the first thing it did was get us our stats. And we can see here that this is from the west, it is checking the stats of the latencies for the pods. And we can see here that the requests going to the east all have significantly higher latencies, and that's because we're jumping across the internet. And let me pull this up here. So this is the dashboard that opened up. And we see here we have our deployments, our pods, and the services should be, let's see. Oh, this is what I want to show you. Now that we've got the multi-cluster set up, we can take a look at our Grafana dashboard. And when we go to the multi-cluster part, we should be getting Linkerd metrics here. Okay, that one didn't work. So again, we have these requests that are going through, and I'm looking for the services now that are defined for each of the deployments. But okay, let's go back over to our console. And the next thing I'm going to do is check the security. So I mentioned earlier that the gateways are using their own certificates, and so that prevents us from accessing the gateway from anywhere that isn't the other gateway. And so the first thing that we see is that TLS is true as we're connecting to each of the pod infos. There was another command in here that is, yeah, this command. We'll just grab this real quick. And what this is going to show us is, so this is starting up a pod in the west context and trying to curl directly the pod, the service in the east. And what we'll see is, as soon as that pod is scheduled, is that we get basically no response back from it. Oh, that's an error. Okay. I'm going to skip that part. Actually, looks like we're out of time. So apologies, I knew this was going to be a very fast presentation. So the only thing else that I was going to show you is that we could do traffic split across the clusters, which is pretty cool. Again, this demo's in our docs, but I hope that you saw the main gist here of how quickly you can get a service mesh running across multiple clusters when you're using Linkerd service mirroring. And that's my time. I'll answer questions in the #1 Track channel.